Hello, and thank you for coming along. Today we're going to look at recalling some of the chapters of the Harvard divestment struggle. This is part one in a series. We'll cover several of the past chapters, but in particular we wanted to look this week because there was to be a Divest Fest at Harvard on Tuesday, May 3rd. Its importance was eclipsed somewhat by the earth-shaking decision of the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade, announced on the same day. But it's important to look at the microchronology of what's happened in the divest movement. So we're going to review some of those issues over the next few weeks. It's important to realize that, first of all, this is old news. The week in May is perhaps the opening of the spring festivals, but in fact, it was back in September 2021, at the very beginning of this school year, that the students declared a victory. Harvard divests from fossil fuels. And in fact, it was quite dramatic. So what happened between September of 2021 and May 3rd, when the Divest Fest took place? Well, briefly put, the COVID lockdown occurred. We thought we would reconvene for in-person teaching at a place like Harvard and other universities around the country, but COVID struck again with variants that kept people inside. So it's important to remember what happened in the microchronology around September 10th, 2021. If you look at the statement of victory back in September 2021, the students put it very clearly. After nearly a decade of organizing by students, faculty, alumni, and community members, we've succeeded in pushing one of the world's richest and most powerful universities to divest from the fossil fuel industry. For too long, Harvard has stood on the wrong side of history, lending legitimacy to the companies driving global warming and climate injustice by investing part of its $42 billion endowment in them. So this was a clear statement for, as they called it, climate justice now, a victory for the Divest Harvard movement. Let's look in detail at actually what happened last September. In fact, the Divest Harvard group of students and citizens and faculty kicked off the year of what was thought to be an in-person semester with an in-person rally outside of University Hall. And in fact, you can see they have all masks on. So while it's a collective event, it's not quite the same as the pre-COVID events. Let's look at this in detail, though, because the sequence is very interesting. They decided to call an in-person rally outside of University Hall, and this occurred, according to the Harvard Crimson, on September 8th. At least they reported it on September 8th. Kelsey Griffin and Kevin Samachi. Okay, what happened next? Well, the next headline comes out: Harvard will move to divest its endowment from fossil fuels. Now, you couldn't think of a more immediate sequence of events. First of all, the students and community members kick off the in-person semester with a rally on what? On the 8th. And then on what? Well, as it turns out, it's the 10th. Updated on the 9th. The story was written on the 9th. At 11:03 p.m. on the 9th, it's updated and published by the Crimson on September 10th. So we have 8th, 9th, and 10th here, and the same picture in the Harvard Crimson. That announces that Harvard will move to divest its endowment from fossil fuels. So from a demonstration reported on the 8th, We get articles then written and updated on the 9th and published on the 10th saying Harvard will move its divestments. So you can see why there's some sense of victory coming out of this micro sequence of events, the 8th, 9th, and 10th of September 2021. Well, that's what led to this sense of victory and statement. Now, what's happened since and what happened before is what we want to look at here. So you would think that this would be part of what is celebrated in the Divest Fest, but for a whole lot of reasons, including the Supreme Court leaked decision, these things are not celebrated at this point. They may be celebrated later. They certainly need to be documented in great detail, and the students are up to the task. In fact, they could write senior theses on this whole movement for decades to come, let alone PhDs. So we're going to recall some of the chapters of the Harvard divestment struggle. We're calling this part one because there are probably going to be other parts as well. And it's moving from victory back in September to the Divest Fest of May 3rd. And we're going to ask, what was the victory? Wasn't it important? Was it true? We're going to ask, okay, how did this come about? How did we get here? Who made it happen? And we're going to ask, what can be learned from these narratives if we actually string them together? The narratives of how did we get here? Who made it happen? How did it all come about? We're then going to look at various key components in the past, including the disruption of the very important symbolic game between Harvard and Yale, and some of the student activism that led to this kind of direct action. And we're going to ask the question, what are the backstories, not only that led to those football game demonstrations, but to the effective movement of the faculty against all the presidents that did not move on this issue. Then we're going to ask, what comes next? All of these questions can't be answered in a single program like this, but over time we're going to look at part 2, 3, 4, and the sequence that's important to keep in mind. Fortunately, some of these things have been recorded in the past by students and others. Programs like this, for example, have looked at Harvard's profitable energy investments in historical perspective. Not only did past presidents own slaves, the entire institution is built in many respects on the profits of the slave trade. And that is something that's been revealed under the most recent presidency of President Bacow in the last few days, in fact, the same week that the Divest Fest was scheduled to take place in May. Then, beyond slavery, of course, Harvard participated, as did all major institutions investing in energy. They participated in the whale oil trade and the energy investments involved in driving to near extinction the largest mammals on the planet. Then, in the 20th century, we've been investing as an institution, Harvard and every other major university, in the forms of energy that are derived from fossilized carbon, whether it be coal, liquid petroleum, or what's been dubbed so-called natural gas. That's part of the problem. It's not natural, and it's in fact released at an enormous scale, accidentally as well as purposefully. In either case, it's devastating to climate change. Either if it's oxidized and then is present as atmospheric CO2, or if it's merely leaked in the process of being extracted. leaked as methane, which is 40 times more powerful as a heat-trapping gas than CO2. This investment in energy has been Harvard's 20th century phenomena, and the one they find hardest to break with. So we're going to look at some of those problems. While some of the other universities in the country, like Stanford, in fact brought themselves to divest from at least coal, Harvard went about arresting. Not divesting, but arresting. People get arrested for stating this opinion on the Harvard campus. We're going to look not only at Harvard, but the institutions that it's enveloped by and embedded within. Institutions including the federal government and presidential leadership that have collapsed in the face of catabolic collapse as a culture. Harvard President Faust says fossil fuel companies are not blocking clean energy. She got it 180 degrees wrong. They have been blocking it, and in fact, just this past week, a three-part series of Frontline revealed not only how they blocked it through a series of denials and then doubt, seeding doubt throughout the country, throughout the world about the climate science, and then delaying something of the tactic that she used herself to delay the decision on fossil fuel investments throughout her entire presidency. But she wasn't alone. Leaders in major American institutions lacked the moral vision to speak truth to future generations, even when they surrounded themselves with their own children. They couldn't speak truth across the generational divide. They knew one thing and they said another. We'll be looking then at particularly the irony of the historian president of Harvard University, who didn't make the transition that was necessary, in spite of everyone who pointed out to her why it was important to make that transition, including very distinguished graduate of Harvard, Timothy Wirth, Senator Timothy Wirth, who later championed the effort against fossil fuels, Desmond Tutu, Robert Massey, Bill McKibben, one of the other distinguished graduates of Harvard, vocal opponent of the investments that Harvard has been making in fossil fuels. But this historian, who should have had some sense of history, in fact, systematically opposed the divestment movement. So, we're going to look at one program that was broadcast back in 2014. It was called What is Warranted? Who is Wise? Is Harvard on the wrong side of history? It certainly is on the wrong side of its own faculty, its students, and its alumni. Why did it hold out so long? What were its responsibilities that were being shirked? Where does the statement warranted or wise come from? Well, we'll have a look.
Hello, and welcome once again to Eco Views and News. Thank you very much for coming along. Today we want to look at this question further of the divestiture movement, because there have been several new chapters of it here locally in reference to Harvard, but also nationally, and we ought to take a look at that in detail. In fact, last week and the week before, we covered a series of rather dramatic events on the Harvard campus, having to do with a kind of succession of things. But there was a very new development this past week. In fact, on Friday, there was a national program devoted to the question of divestiture that deserves our attention. The title is, "What is Warranted? Who is Wise?" Two questions. And the subtext is Harvard on the wrong side of history here? Harvard has made a very clear statement through its president, its financial officers, that it doesn't want to get involved in divestment. At the same time, the president announced a new fund to tackle climate change. The fund of $20 million was to go to help students and faculty come up with sustainability and climate change proposals, and they were invited to, in effect, come forward with proposals. But this was said at the same time that Faust announced that Harvard would not be cutting its ties to the fossil fuel companies, something which students had asked it to do for a while now in the Divest Harvard campaign. Now, you recall that just as a coincidence, 2 weeks ago, at the same time that Faust announced a $20 million new fund, Bishop Desmond Tutu, former bishop in South Africa, in fact, issued a statement in The Guardian in England, which was really quite forceful about the need to get involved in divestment because it had been so successful in South Africa. Desmond called for an anti-apartheid style boycott of the fossil fuel industry, and it was very clear. His statement was read aloud by Juan Gonzalez on Democracy Now! Let's listen a second.
In an article published in The Guardian, Tutu wrote, "People of conscience need to break their ties with corporations financing the injustice of climate change. We can, for instance, boycott events, sports teams, and media programming sponsored by fossil fuel energy companies." Tutu went on to write, quote, "We can encourage more of our universities and municipalities and cultural institutions to cut their ties to the fossil fuel industry." Last year, Desmond Tutu appeared in a video backing the fossil fuel divestment campaign.
The divestment movement played a key role in helping liberate South Africa. The corporations understood the logic of money even when they weren't swayed by the dictates of morality. Climate change is a deeply moral issue too, of course. Here in Africa, we see the dreadful suffering of people from worsening drought, from rising food prices, from floods, even though they've done nothing to cause the situation. Once again, we can join together as a world and put pressure where it counts.
Okay, well, put pressure where it counts was the appeal that he made. And in fact, it was just that appeal that students were trying to forward. In response to, in part, the new fund announcement for $20 million, students have come forward and said Harvard President Drew Faust is still wrong on climate change. In an editorial on April 25th, actually it was on the 24th, Chloe Maxman and Canyon Woodward, in an article in the Student Nation, came forward with a pretty dramatic statement that, in effect, countered the president's appeal for $20 million to the new fund in a title given pretty prominent presence there. Harvard President Drew Faust is still wrong on climate change. In a nationwide magazine, in fact, Student Nation, it's a student version or component to the Nation magazine, they outline their case for why the president is still wrong. I'd urge you to get in touch with these things on the website, and in fact you can on ecojustice.tv. You can also see that there's some discussion of the Harvard faculty open letter, which pointed out that we know that fossil fuels cause climate change of unprecedented destructive potential. And you recall from our last program that James Anderson came forward, as many others did, almost 90 others, in fact more than 90 others on the faculty, came forward to sign a divestment letter and began this movement called Faculty for Divestment, moving our endowment beyond fossil fuels. It's worth getting in touch with that full text of the letter as well through EcoJustice TV. You can see how he responded.
Nearly 100 members of the faculty at Harvard University released an open letter Thursday calling on the Ivy League school to sell off its interest in oil, gas, and coal companies.
Professor Anderson, why don't you begin? Talk about why you signed this letter and what exactly it says.
Well, I signed the letter because this fossil fuel question is unique in many ways. First, the combustion of fossil fuels has and will continue to bring serious and irreversible change to the structure of the Earth's climate. And second, the fossil fuel industry has and will continue to provide very significant misinformation about this problem to the general public. The third issue revolves around leadership that I believe all universities should execute, and that was best captured really when President Bach divested from the tobacco industry, and Harvard responded similarly to the apartheid question. And in the case of climate change and its relation to energy, this is the most serious problem facing this and subsequent generations, and so I believe it's crucially important for universities to step forward and exhibit leadership, because if they don't, who will? The government is now crippled by both misinformation and special interests, and in many regards the business industry should not necessarily be expected, although we would hope they would, to exhibit leadership in this matter.
Well, Professor Anderson, could you talk about the...
In effect, he's saying, listen, there's no one else out there. The government itself is compromised, and it's totally beholden to the interests that are, in effect, controlling the information on this. And the disinformation and misinformation from the fossil fuel companies has totally skewed the public's understanding of this. So he's saying, listen, as a matter of education and as a matter of teaching leaders, Harvard has got to take the lead on this, because it's not going to come from elsewhere. Well, the further component of this that came out this last week was in a national broadcast by Moyers and Company entitled Putting the Freeze on Global Warming. Once again, you can get at it through ecojustice.tv, just under that title, search for that title. Bill Moyers himself came out with a framing of the issue. Take a look. It's really quite powerful. He puts it in the context of a national struggle.
Welcome. For growing numbers of people, the reality of global warming is so urgent, they've given up waiting for governments to act, and they've decided it's folly to expect the coal, oil, and gas companies ever to admit their products are burning up the earth. So these aroused citizens are going for the jugular. They're directing their efforts directly at the one place held sacred by the industry, the bottom line. It's called Divestment, a campaign to persuade investors to take their money out of fossil fuel companies. Foundations, faith groups, pension funds, cities, and universities are being urged to take the lead, to sell their shares in polluting industries and go fossil-free. On more than 300 college campuses, from Middlebury in Vermont to Berkeley in California, students are calling on their schools to divest. Sometimes they are rebuffed, as happened recently at Harvard, which at over $32 billion has the largest university endowment in the country.
Now, this is a very interesting encapsulation, because as much as Harvard would like to keep the problem local and in reference to its own little investments, it's now national, and it's now in the national spotlight. In fact, True Faust is quoted here by Bill Moyers very poignantly in reference to the $32 billion fund of endowment that it manages.
Last fall, the school's president said divestiture was neither warranted or wise. But this month, nearly 100 faculty members sided with the students. They said our university invests in the fossil fuel industry. We now know that fossil fuels cause climate change of unprecedented destructive potential. Divestment has worked once before and in a big way. 3 decades ago, students, religious communities, and unions sustained a campaign against U.S. companies doing business with South Africa and helped put an end to apartheid. Only 4 months after his release from prison, Nelson Mandela came to California to say thank you to Americans who kept up the economic pressure. With me now are two people who are leaders of this new divestment movement. Ellen Dorsey is Executive Director of the Wallace Global Fund and a catalyst in the coalition of 17 foundations known as Divest, Invest, Philanthropy. Its members have agreed to pull out of fossil fuel stocks and invest in companies committed to climate change solutions. Thomas Van Dyke, a self-described child of corporate America, was so convinced of the power of socially responsible investing that he's made a career out of it. He's now Senior Vice President, Financial Advisor of RBC Wealth Management, and Board Chair of As You Sow. That's a shareholder advocacy foundation. Welcome to both of you.
Okay. Now here's the case being made not just by students, not just by faculty, but by a whole new group of investors, one of whom's head of a group called Divest, Invest. In other words, yes, you're taking your money out of the social bads and putting them into social goods. This is the whole point behind the divestiture movement. It's not to say get out of the marketplace altogether. It's saying invest your assets in companies that are going to help us make the transition to a post-fossil fuel world. Because there is no such thing as a survivable fossil fuel world. On the one hand, we're going to run more and more out of those fossil fuels. But even with those remaining, we can't live in a global system that has all of that terrestrial carbon, whether it's natural gas or coal or petroleum, converted into CO2 in the atmosphere. It's an unlivable, unsurvivable environment. So please leave those assets sequestered where they are, is the point that they're making. And they're making it very effectively now as an investment question. The fiduciary responsibility of those institutes that are making money off of the exposure and exploitation of that carbon are not acting in terms of their long-term fiduciary responsibility. This is a case that's being made now more and more confidently and powerfully by the investment community. Take a look at the way Bill puts it to them.
Skeptics say your campaign to divest is a flea on the tail of an elephant, a nuisance to the fossil fuel industry, but no real threat. How do you respond to that?
Frankly, 4 years ago, I was incredibly pessimistic that we could have any impact on this climate change issue. In 2009, the governments of the world failed to come to any kind of meaningful agreement at the Copenhagen meeting. In 2010, climate legislation failed in the U.S. Senate. And into that vacuum stepped a student movement. And they did take a play from the anti-apartheid playbook. And they said, we're putting the focus right on the industry itself. And because the industry is driving the problem, it is funding denial of the problem, it is refusing to advance safe and clean alternatives, and it's shutting down the policy process with campaign contributions and lobbying. And so by putting the target on the fossil fuel industry, the goal is not to have an immediate economic impact on the fossil fuel industry, but to isolate it as a moral pariah, like apartheid, like tobacco.
Remember in South Africa days, they said, look, divestment doesn't make any sense. And then Desmond Tutu said, we don't want our chains made more comfortable. We need to have people pull out to help with the economic transition of that society. I think divestment from fossil fuels is the same. Their vision of what the planet looks like and the idea of being able to drill and burn all the fossil fuels that they have on their balance sheets today is just something that civilization cannot survive.
Okay. Now investors are realizing this. This is something that civilization cannot survive. And their approach to this is very interesting and, in fact, quite instructive, because what they're saying, in effect, is that, Harvard, you better figure this one out and get on the right side of it. Bill puts it to them as a question, too.
Investments.
But take Harvard. It's the big fish in the pond, $32 billion in endowment. The president of Harvard says that what you two want, she didn't call you by name, but you can imagine who she had in mind, is unwarranted and unwise, that it would come at a substantial economic cost to the university. Then there's Bowdoin College, small college in Maine with $1 billion endowment, and the chief of Bowdoin's $1 billion endowment says divesting would have cost the college $100 million over the last decade. And I suspect if she were sitting here, she would say to you, Tom Van Dyke, wouldn't that be fiducially irresponsible on my part?
I would say that's bad math. I would say you don't have creative enough people running your money for you if that's the case.
Here's an investment officer saying, okay, I would say that's bad math. You don't have creative enough people running your investments for you. So, Harvard, maybe you ought to check it out. This is being said within the financial community to institutions that hold investments like Harvard in the fossil fuel area.
What is a problem is you have these different hedge funds that they're involved in that have particular funds that they can't control what's actually held in that. And so they're worried they'll have to fire that particular hedge fund.
And they don't like to do that.
And they don't want to do
particularly if they're producing good returns.
But if enough endowments get together and say, hey, why don't you set up a sleeve that is fossil fuel free? And you can short the coal companies and, and go long the solar companies, and you can hedge that if you want. But you just can't be buying the top 200 companies. My guess is given the size of that market, that those hedge funds will say, sure, we'll set up a sleeve for you guys. We'll humor you. And if they put pressure on their managers to do that, my guess is the managers will do that. Right now, they're not willing to take that next step and pressure those managers. All they need to do is ask.
I would also argue that looking back over the past 10 years, we've seen dramatic changes in the financial markets. And I think it's problematic to try and look at the past 10 years and predict the future. And if you look at the case studies of institutions like my foundation and other foundations that we're partnering with that have in fact divested from fossil fuels, invested in climate solutions, renewables, and clean tech, we've done very well in the market in the near term, short term, and we're confident when you look at the projections for renewables and you look at the risks, the financial risks of staying invested in fossil fuels over the long term, I feel like we are making the right bet. We are the ones investing in the future, and we'll do well, and have done well.
And I do think coal is a precursor to that. I mean, if you look at what coal's done for the last 4 or 5 years, coal has dropped dramatically, and it's a very poor performing
in the market.
In the market,
price shares too.
Oh yeah, it's been crushed. And we think that oil could be a precursor to what might happen to oil in the next decade or so. So it's really about looking at the fiduciary risk and the valuation, because if these oil companies don't responsibly deal with that, there's going to be a risk there associated with owning those companies.
But let me shift gears a little bit, because you raised this issue of fiduciary duty. And I would argue that any institution that receives charitable tax status because they serve the public good has to look at whether their investments are in fact serving the public good. And they're...
Whoa, that's a whole new argument. Harvard receives the tax status because it's serving the public good. Are its investments serving the public good? This is a larger question as to whether Harvard should, in a sense, be benefiting from the tax-free status if it's not acting in the public good. She makes the case very strongly.
Could not be arguably a more stark case. about the role of the fossil fuel industry in driving climate change. And if you have a mission to protect the public good, climate change will impact that dramatically, whether your focus is education, whether your focus is the environment, whether your focus is human rights. Climate change will impact your mission as a charitable institution. And so I think as a fiduciary matter to protect your mission, you should be looking at your investments in fossil fuels. And when you couple that with the financial risks associated with staying in fossil fuels over the long term, because as a fiduciary, you're to be looking at the long-term viability of your investments, I think the ethical and the financial align in a pretty powerful way.
But I've heard
Okay, the ethical and the financial are aligned as a powerful logic to get out of fossil fuels now. Now, it's not going to be easy, and Jim Anderson has pointed this out as a faculty member in his faculty statement. Basically, we're entangled with fossil fuels in a way that can't be engineered just tomorrow or just as a matter of opinion very quickly, but it means that we have to start using all our cleverness and our intention to move that in the right direction. So the question really becomes very quickly, what is warranted and who is wise? When the president of Harvard used the phrase that divesting from fossil fuels is neither warranted or wise, she's inviting us to investigate what is warranted, who is wise, in reference to the coming changes in the climate. This is why the students are responding quite vociferously on the national scale with a letter to the nation. Harvard President Drew Faust is still wrong. It's why the faculty has called for divestment. And it's why there's going to be a set of things on April 30th, a whole series of events. Come out for it if you can in front of Massachusetts Hall at 10 a.m. Keep in touch on air and online as we cover these things of fossil fuel divestment and the future it holds. Thank you very much. See you next week.